and welcome to this video about the fiskaltrust.Middleware. My name is Tom and I will guide you through this technical introduction for PosCreators. In this video we will cover different aspects of implementing and integrating the fiskaltrust.Middleware into your POS software. So the target audience of this video is mostly developers or technicians that are interested in how to include the middleware into their product. Let's have a look at the agenda first. In the beginning, we will cover the functionality and the architecture of the middleware, so basically what it does and how it can be used and how the components play together to fulfill the national regulations. Then we will take a deep dive into the interface. We will cover the data flow, the data structures, and also the failure scenarios that you need to cover when implementing the middleware. After that, we will also have a look at operational environment considerations and also how the middleware can be configured from a user point of view. And after that, we will play through all of these things that we have just seen by doing a live demo. We will configure a middleware instance in our portal, we will download it onto my developer machine, and we will send some requests to a real TSE. When we've done that, we will also cover the more process aspects of the whole thing. So we will have a look at the phases of integration, which also means which touch points with other partner groups you have, and how you can go through this with ease. Of course, we also offer some tools to support this integration and rollout processes, and we will also have a look at those. And we will conclude the presentation with an overview about our documentation, the getting started material, and also how you can reach the support in case you're stuck and need help. So without further ado, let's directly jump into the topic and having an overview about the functionality and the architecture of the middleware. Before going into detail, let's briefly reconsider what the middleware is meant to do. The fiskaltrust.Middleware is a piece of software that should abstract away the complexity of fiscalization regulations. As you are probably aware of, these fiscalization laws are different in each country and they usually tend to be very complex, especially if you're not originally from this country. So the middleware is meant to operate as a black box and to take care of all these things, like where the data needs to be stored, how long it should be preserved, and which information you need to print onto receipts, so that you can focus on your core business of delivering value and features for your industry, for your customers. Let's have a look at how this works. Here on the left side we have the POS software. And this POS software can communicate with the middleware via the iPOS interface. This is a cross-national interface, which means that it is the same in each country we operate in. No matter where you use the middleware, you can always use the same interface, the same communication protocols, the same data structures, and so on. The only thing that changes is the tagging, something that we see later. So, when you decide to implement the middleware, you can also pick the communication protocol that you want to use or that makes sense in your ecosystem, for example REST, gRPC, or even WCF or SOAP. The middleware behaves the same no matter which of these protocols you pick. When you have sent a request to the middleware, it will be first processed by the fiskaltrust security mechanism. This security mechanism is also the same in each country. It provides like a security baseline that we think makes sense even if it's not legally required in each country, although in some, at least in parts. But we just think it makes sense to assign a unique receipt number and to also add the receipts to a hash chain so that they are tamper-proof. Also, the security mechanism covers the data storage. So this also is configurable and integrates therefore hopefully very well into your existing ecosystem. All of this business logic that we have seen until here is covered in a component we call Queue. From here it gets more country specific. Because as you probably know, there are different regulations in each country and also different signing services and devices. We try to encapsulate those in different SCUs, signature creation units. So these are just an abstraction of the signing service and device that comes afterwards, may it a cloud service or, for example, also a local hardware device. So the middleware uses this abstraction of this device, the SCU, to perform the actual signing operation, and it gets back some signatures that are then sent back to the POS software, and these contain information about what you need to print onto the receipt, and it's already prepared in a way so that you can do this very easily. The only thing left to do is to store the data, to print it, and then you're good. So this was quite high level. Let's have a more detailed look on the interface and the data flow. Let's start with the simplest method, the echo method. As the name says it, the echo method of the middleware is just meant as a communication test. It will just respond back with the same text, the same message that you sent to it. You can, for example, use this like a ping, and you can just check if the queue is there and if it's answering. So far, so simple. The sign method is probably actually far more interesting because it's responsible for processing receipts. And these receipts could either be normal business case receipts, like processing an order, processing a POS receipt, but it could also be some kind of special receipt that triggers specific functionality in the middleware, like a daily closing, for example, or a zero-risk receipt to restore communication in case of a failure. Let's have a more detailed look in how all of this works. When you call the sign method, you need to pass a sign request, or a receipt request, as it's often called in our documentation. This receipt request contains a header with mandatory information, and this will probably be static in your case, and also charge and pay items. Charge items contain the goods and services that are printed onto the receipt. So this could, for example, be free beers. The pay items, on the other hand, contain the information about how the goods and services were paid. This could, for example, be 12 euros in cash. It could also be $100 in a credit card payment, and so on. So you just add this information together with an optional request footer and send this to the sign endpoint of the middleware. The middleware will then take care of processing this like we've seen before, and it will respond back with a receipt response, which again contains the charge and pay items and also, most importantly, the signature block. These signatures are generated by the middleware and usually contains signed data. And this is the data that you need to print onto the receipt. For example, this could be a QR code already in the correct format that you only need to print it. Let's have a more detailed look on how the data flow looks like, especially when including more details of the POS software. Of course, depending on your software, on your system architecture, you may or may not have a terminal and you may or not have a server. So it could also easily be that these components are in one system, obviously. The point here, though, is that we again see that the terminal, for example, in this architecture, collects charge and pay items, sends it to the server, to the POS system, which then persists this data, sends the sign request, the middleware does what it does best, and answers with a sign response. You should also persist this data afterwards, just to be sure, and then you can take it and easily take this information and print it onto the receipt. Something that's additionally new here in this graph is also the helipad helper and this helipad server components. These components, with the helipad helper being local and the helipad server being in the cloud, are responsible for pushing the data to the fiskaltrust cloud systems. This can then, for example, be used to fulfill legal revision safe storage requirements, which are offered from fiskaltrust as add-on products. We will not cover these topics here in too much detail, but basically that's how it works. And this happens each 5 minutes. It's a non-blocking asynchronous operation, so you can continue sending receipts while this upload works. It will not intervene in any way with the ongoing process of the middleware. Okay, so this was pretty easy for regular receipts. Good news is that it's actually nearly the same for special receipts. So a special receipt, in this case, is used to execute specific functionalities. This could be a zero receipt, it could be a daily closing receipt, or maybe you would send one when you put the queue or the middleware into operation in the very beginning of the lifetime of the cash register. You see that basically the whole flow works exactly the same. The middleware just detects that this is a special receipt according to the tag that we will again see later, and then it will process it how it needs to be processed. It will also produce a response that you can then use, and you can just, again, if required from a legal perspective, print this data onto a physical receipt. Okay, that was the happy path. Now let's have a look at failure scenarios, and good news is that it's also pretty straightforward to cover those. We have seen two common failure scenarios, and we want to briefly speak about both of them. The first is that the signing device or the signing cloud service, whatever, is not reachable. In terms of a cloud service, most realistic scenario is that just the internet connection gets lost, which happens regularly. For example, if it's a local device, maybe the USB stick was unplugged and so on. So there are different options how this can happen. Keep in mind that in this scenario, the middleware itself is still reachable. It's just that the middleware or the SCU abstraction will not be able to reach the SSCD anymore. In this case, the middleware will only try to communicate with the signing service or the signing device once, and afterwards it will switch to a failure mode. We've implemented this circuit breaker pattern so that the operator doesn't have to wait. Because imagine, like, maybe we have a timeout of 30 seconds, and for each cash sale at a supermarket, the operator would need to wait 30 seconds, and then he would anyway not get back a processed response from the signing device. And that's why we basically go into failed mode. And this is signalized by the middleware because, by adding the FT state hexadecimal 2 to the response. So we have a response property called state. If everything goes well, this is 0, and if it's in failed mode, this is 2. And while the middleware is in failed mode, it will not try to communicate with the SSCD anymore, so that there are no additional delays. When the internet connection could be restored, the only thing you need to do is sending a 0 receipt. A 0 receipt is a receipt without charge items, without pay items, and with a specific tag. And this is just meant to restore the communication. The middleware will try to process this. It will see if the communication is again available. And if yes, it will respond back with a state of 0, which means success. And of course, also a list of the requests that could not be signed during this period. If at this point in time the communication cannot be restored because maybe the internet is still down, of course there will not be a success state reported back. And that's also why we usually recommend to implement the 0 receipt as a manual action. Because when this is done automatically, so let's just assume that your POS software notices that the middleware is in failed mode, and then it automatically immediately sends a 0 receipt. At this point in time, we cannot know if the communication is actually doable again. Maybe the USB stick is still unplugged. So this is a potential bottleneck that will block further signing, because all the signing needs to be done sequentially from the middleware. And that's why we recommend usually to just maybe leave this to the operator, to maybe present a message to the operator of the POS software that informs them about the current outage of the signature creation device. And when they think that it's again doable, again connectable, maybe because there is not much business going on currently, or because they know that the USB stick was plugged back in, then they can send a 0 receipt with a button maybe, and the communication is restored. Also, there is no need to resend any receipts to the middleware that were processed during the failure mode, because they are anyway stored in the receipt chain and in the database of the middleware. So after the 0 receipt was successful, this case is done. And then there is a second scenario. In this scenario, the POS software or the POS system is actually not able to reach the middleware at all anymore. If everything is integrated into one cash register, this is probably not a common scenario, but it's of course also possible to just operate the middleware on a back office PC or maybe even in the cloud. And in that case, of course, this scenario could happen. So this would mean that there is absolutely no communication possible anymore with the middleware. If that happens, the POS software can continue to hand out receipts. Basically, you need to store the data in your database. You need to mark it to be sent later to the middleware. You need to persist it, of course, and you need to print a hint on the receipt that says security mechanism outage or something like that. When the communication could be restored and the middleware is again reachable, in this case, you need to send the receipts that could not be sent to the middleware again to it, and we call this the late signing mode. So this can be done as soon as it's restored again, and this is usually something you would do automatically. So you just add a flag to the receipt cases that I mentioned previously and that we will see later in more detail, and this will automatically tell the middleware that, hey, this was a receipt that was actually handed out like 2 hours ago, for example, and this is just late signing. Depending on the local regulations, we might either send this to the signing device or not. For example, in Germany, it's not mandatory to send this to the TSE. In other countries, it might be. So as soon as the middleware is again reachable, just send all the missed requests to it. It will respond back, of course. You should process this data. You should print this depending on legal regulations. And when you're done, so when you have sent all of the receipts, you again just send a 0 receipt. It will respond back with a state 0 if everything was successful, and then you continue to process as before. So the major difference basically is between failure scenario 1 and 2. In scenario 1, you don't need to send anything afterwards. And if the middleware is not reachable at all anymore, in scenario 2, you need to. And that's it. These are the most common failure scenarios. Okay, so we have learned that the sign method can be used to process receipts and actually to send and transmit data to the middleware. Now we also need an option or a method to get back this data in the form of exports, and this is what the journal method is meant for. Let's have a look at this works, because basically it's pretty simple. The journal method just takes a type, and depending on that type, it will produce a different kind of export. There are two categories that we could group types into. First of all, the generic types that may produce, for example, raw data exports of the received responses and requests, or maybe we'll give you the receipt journal where you can see the chaining and so on. And on the other hand, we have national exports like the DSFIN-VK in Germany and the DEP export in Austria. These are required by law, and the middleware is able to produce them from the raw data that we have sent previously via the sign method on demand. Of course, it's also possible to send optional parameters to, for example, limit the time range of the export, so you don't always have to export everything. Maybe you're only interested in the data from the last month. So basically, if you decide to not use the archiving products from Fiscal Trust, or your customers decide to not do that, you need to implement the journal method and make sure that you export the data regularly and store this on a revision safe storage, depending on the national regulations, of course. Okay, so we have now seen how we can interact with the middleware, how we can implement it into POS software, and which methods basically need to be called to start specific functionality on middleware side. Before we go into the demo, let's have a look at where and how we can operate the middleware, so in which scenarios, in which cases, and how it can be configured. First of all, the middleware offers a broad variety of possible operational environments. So no matter how and where your POS software is running, we probably got you covered with a possibility to run the middleware there as well. This goes from having local installations, like basically maybe on the cash register itself, to have a fully integrated system with all the software that is needed. Also over having a server, maybe in a local network, maybe in the back office, or in a data center even. For these data center cases, we even offer Kubernetes, Helm charts, and Docker containers. So no matter how you want to operate your middleware installations and your POS software, we most likely have the right installation method for you. Finally, we also offer a fully cloud-hosted installation of the middleware in our cloud. This means that you don't have to take care of anything regarding rollout. Basically, you just compose the configuration, as we will see in the next slide and in the demo, and then you just send or start sending requests to our cloud software, and we take care of all the internal dangling together. Unfortunately, this is not yet available in Germany, but of course we're working on that. Okay, then the configuration of middleware instances. We've already covered two of the three parts basically that are already in there. We mentioned the queues. A queue package contains the business logic, and also it is responsible for communicating with the data layer. So this means that depending on the database you want to use, SQLite, MySQL, and so on, you would like to pick another queue. The logic itself stays the same, and also the interface stays the same. Then we have the SCU, which is an abstraction of the signing device or service behind that. So for example, if you want to look at Swiss Bitadria TSE, you would pick the SCU for that. If you want a Fiscally Cloud TSE, we also got an SCU for that. And the same, for example, goes for some A-Trust signing services in Austria and so on. So usually there is one distinctive SCU per signing service or device, and you can just plug those in, basically. These packages are then grouped together in a cache box. A cache box is, at its plain level, a configuration container, which basically is a JSON file that contains information about all the queue and SCU packages that are in there. And that's it regarding configuration. So now that we have seen how we can integrate the middleware with which methods we need to work with and how we can configure it and deploy it, let's have a look at the live demo showing all these things. So we will create a cache box, a queue and an SCU in our demo portal, this time in Germany, but it would work the same in Austria and France. We will download this to my local developer machine, and we will then just send some demo requests with our demo collection and Postman to see how all of this is working in a real world scenario. Let's get started. I've already opened the sandbox portal for Germany here, which is portal-sandbox.fiskaltrust.De. The sandbox portals, or generally the sandbox systems we offer, are an exact copy of our production systems, just with the differentiation that in here you can try everything, even operations that would normally cost money, like ordering cloud TSEs, for example, with no costs and also with no risk regarding any production deployments. So if you want to try something, we generally recommend to have a look at the sandbox to do so before doing this in production. Let's have a look now. Of course, you should create your own portal account for free. We will just use one of our existing demo accounts to speed up the process. And after we have logged in and this account already has the PosCreator role enabled, we basically see the most basic menu items here to the left. We will configure everything manually. As we will hear later, it's also possible to automate all of the steps that we will now be doing, but for doing it for the first time manually is usually a nicer approach. Let's get started. We will first create a queue, then we will have a look at creating a signature creation unit or an SCU, and then we will put all of these things together in a cache box, which we can then download into our local middleware installation. So let's start with the queue. We will need to give it a name or a description and a cache box identification, which in Germany will be used as the TSE client ID. So this should be something without any special characters and without any empty spaces and stuff like that. So we will just call this webinar 2022, and we will use the same name for the cache box identification because in a demo scenario it's not that important. Here we could also pick a package now. As I've said, we can use SQLite, we could use Entity Framework for SQL Server connections, and we can also use MySQL. There's even an in-memory database for testing. This is of course not available in production. We will stick to SQLite because it's the easiest thing to do in the beginning, and then we will just save that. Now we will need to set an URL. This URL will be used by your POS software to communicate with the middleware. So this could either be gRPC, REST, SOAP, or even .NET or even NetPipes. I'm gonna use REST because that works best with Postman and the sample collection. And that's it. We have now created a queue. And after everything was saved, we can use the search box in here and we will be able to find it. So this is the queue we will use. Now let's do the same thing for the signature creation unit. The signature creation unit again is the abstraction for the TSE we will use. In our demo we will use a Swissbit hardware TSE because this is what I have available here at my development machine. So we will just create a new one. As you can see, there are packages for all the different signing methodologies, all the different TSEs that are available in Germany, from CryptoVision hardware TSEs and Swissbit hardware TSEs to Swissbit Cloud and also Fiscally and the Deutsche Fiskalcloud. As said, we will just pick Swissbit, which is the hardware one. If we were in Austria or in France, we would see different options here. For example, in Austria, we would have options to pick a smart card. Okay, we also need a name for that. We will just use the same name as before and just add SCU so that we can easily find that. Then we click Save. And again, we have to select a URL. This URL will be used internally by the middleware to communicate with the SCU. So you will usually not call this SCU, but the middleware will. In this case, we will just for a difference pick gRPC. Okay, so we have now created a queue and a signature creation unit, and we need to put this together into a cache box before we can start working with this. So I selected cache box on the left. I'm going to click on add to the top right here. And again, we need to give it a description. I'll just use the same as before. We could also pick an outlet, but that's not mandatory here. And then click save. Now we have a cache box. And the next thing we need to do, so I added this to the search bar to easier find it, and we have it here. We need to add the packages to this cache box. We could do this by drag and drop. I prefer the list view, but this is really a matter of taste. Both is basically doing the same. We can use the search bar again to make sure that we only have the queues and the SUs that we now just created. I'm going to select those two under queues and signature creation units. And then we can just again save the configuration. If we now reload the page, and we extend this, we will see that now the queue that we just created and the SCU that we just created are both in this configuration. There is one final step missing before we can click rebuild to put all of this in action. We need to connect the queue to the SCU. In Germany, each queue needs to be hardwired to an SCU or to an SCE ultimately, a TSE, because yeah, this is what the legal regulations enforce. So we will use this button here, which will open a dialog. And in here, we can pick the SCU we just created so that it's connected to the queue. The queue will now know that it has to use the URL that we configured previously for the SCU to communicate with it. Okay, then we click Rebuild Configuration, because this is part of our two-step configuration program, so you could do all of this also in a live system without having any impact on your users. And when you're done, you click Rebuild, which basically marks that everything is ready, and then it will become active. Okay, we have now clicked Rebuild, and now let's download the launcher. I'm on Windows here, so I'm going to use the first button, but as you see, you could also use the Linux launcher, and there is even an Android alternative, or an offline version for people without internet connection. I'm going to just use the normal online launcher for Windows, and this will take a few seconds. When the download finished, we can just open the zip file and extract it. Here we will see that there is a fiskaltrust.exe which needs to be called with specific parameters to host the right cache box. Just gonna extract this to my local machine now. And also included in the zip file are batch files, so test CMDs and install and uninstall service CMDs that we can use to basically already pass the correct middleware configuration parameters to the exe file, so we don't need to do anything manually in here. So let's have a look at the test CMD. This is basically the easiest approach to start it, and this is probably what you want to work with in a development scenario. So I'm just going to open this as an administrator here because I picked a port that needed administrative privileges. And now we're basically seeing the first start of the middleware. This might take a few seconds longer because on the first start, the packages that we configured are downloaded. The second and all the other starts will be much faster than that. Okay, we use the magic of video editing to skip this first download, but if we have now a look into the protocol or into the logs, we will see that the packages were downloaded. We have the SwissBit and the SQLite package we've configured. We have stored the configuration locally now. Some database updates were created because this is the first run, and the middleware was successfully started. The only thing left to do now is to open either your sample tool if you want to use that, or Postman, which we usually recommend for some first tests because it's very easy to use. Postman is just sending REST requests from a specific already predefined collection to the middleware. We will see later where you can obtain this collection. I've already did this in our example, and the only thing we now need to do is to configure the cache box ID and the URL of the queue. We do this here by clicking on the middleware and then on variables. And we're just gonna copy this data here directly from the portal. So we have the cashbox ID that we need to add here. And we need to set the base URL. The base URL can directly be copied from here. Just make sure that you do not copy the REST part, because obviously Postman does not understand this. It's actually an HTTP URL. This is just for clearer sight directly in the portal. So we have copied the right part. We've added that here. We can now save this and we're good. So the first thing we will probably do is sending an echo request. And I'm using the German echo request here because we are in a German middleware instance. And we can just send this message. And we will get back an echo response with the exact same text as we sent there. So this was the most basic operation that we could do. Since we have created a new queue, the very first thing we want to do before we can do anything operation-wise is to send an initial operation receipt. The initial operation receipt puts the queue into action. It also registers the TSE, it sets up the TSE in Germany, and it also will register the queue as a client of the TSE. So we can now just send this initial operation receipt. This might take a few seconds because it's actually doing some background operations on the TSE. We can also open the logs in here and we will see some new log messages that state that the TSE device was successfully initialized and that the TSE client, which is in this case our queue, was also successfully registered. And back to Postman, we see that we got a full-blown response back. We also got signatures back. So this is already data that was signed by the TSE via the middleware. Okay, and that's it. That was the first sign request that we have now sent. Obviously, we only want to do that once because, yeah, it's a one-shot operation at the very beginning. Maybe we also want to do some POS receipts to have cash payments for some classic goods or services. So let's also try this out. Before we send it, we can see that, as mentioned before, here we have these charge items, which is in this case 2 coffee to go and 1 Brötchen, so 1 piece of bread. And this is paid with cash in the amount of €4.50. And we can also just send this. And when we did so, we again will get the response back. We will have some additional details in this header. And we again have the signatures. So the signatures in this case contain the QR code that you could print directly on the receipt. This can be identified by the signature format and the signature type, which also use the tagging or the casing that we have described before and that we will see later on in the documentation. And that's it. So you got all the data back that you need to print onto the receipt, and you could actually just do so. And of course, as you see here, we have quite a broad variety of business case examples, like simple ones, as we have seen before, or also more complex ones, like for example, hotel stays and bar consumptions with orders and things like that, restaurant operations, retail operations, whatever. So it's usually a good start to have a look in here because maybe your business case that you need for your POS software is already covered by these samples. And of course, we have the same thing for France and for Austria. The examples in Austria and France differ from those to Germany, mostly in these cases. And that's it. So we have set up a middleware instance, we have downloaded it onto a local machine, and we have sent some first demo requests in actually under 5 minutes. The next thing we want to talk about are the phases of integration. This mostly covers the touchpoint with fiskaltrust, the touchpoints with other external partners like the POS dealers who are responsible for rolling out the middleware, and we will just have a look at those now. Keep in mind that this is just a recommendation. Depending on your partner process, on your developer process, this might look slightly different, but what we show here is something that has proven to be the most straightforward way. All of this starts with, as we have seen now, setting up your developer environment. So you should register in the sandbox, you should create your account, you should think about, for example, which TSE you want to use for testing if you're in Germany, or which other signing service in any other country. And then you can go straight into implementation phase. So you would probably consult the documentation and identify business cases for your specific use case. This could, for example, if you have a hotel, be hotel stays, this could be orders that come up front and so on. Also, you need to implement the required special receipts. This is what we have seen now, for example, the initial operation receipt. It would also, for example, be a daily closing or a monthly closing or a yearly closing. When you have done that, you also need to handle the failure scenarios, so the 2 scenarios we got to know before, and then basically your first prototype should already be ready. This is the point in time when you can invite the POS dealers and, for example, prepare some templates for them for easier rollout. Also, you should, of course, consult them for how they want to do these rollouts, how they want to integrate your software into systems, and so on. And then we usually recommend to do some pilot installations before going into an all-in rollout in the very beginning. So maybe there are some very friendly POS operators that you and your POS dealer know, and these might be the first ones to roll out the middleware to get some knowledge on how all of this works, how the rollout process works at a not so big scale. Usually this is a nice first step. After that, you will most likely find some minor bugs in your implementation, obviously, because that's how software works, and maybe also some missing business cases that your POS operators or maybe even the POS dealers identified. And that's why this might be an iterative process to go through these things again. When all of this looks good, basically you're done with the implementation and integration. You just hand over everything to your POS dealer, all the pieces of software that you created, the packages, maybe the templates that assist the rollout. And the POS dealer can then just go into the large-scale rollout with everything you have prepared. And that's it from a POS creator perspective. Of course, this includes several steps. And we, of course, also offer some tooling to support this integration and rollout phases. The major tool we offer is what we have already seen before, the portal. The portal is basically an end-to-end management solution to guide you through all these integration and rollout scenarios and all the processes that are related to that. There are some specific features of the portal that probably are relevant for you as a POS creator mostly. The first one is what we already have seen. This was the configuration section, so where you can put all of these things together manually. You can create queues and SCUs in this section, and you can just download the launcher so that you can try them on your development environments. This is mostly used by POS creators. We also have the possibility to register your POS system and to invite POS dealers to these systems. This is usually a good idea in most countries and actually required in some, like in Germany, because the POS system data is mandatory for some exports. When we say POS system data, we actually speak of very high-level data like the name of the system, maybe the version number, the major version number, and also some minor other things. So nothing big, this should be done in a few minutes, and you can use this to actually invite your POS dealers to the Fiscal Trust portal and directly connect with them. And finally, as briefly mentioned before, we also have the option to configure templates for a simpler rollout for your POS dealers. A template is basically a JSON file that you can also publish in the portal that can then be used in the rollout management. So you would maybe prepare a cashbox or a cashbox template that contains maybe an entity framework connection or an entity framework package because your users are using SQL Server. Maybe you already also know which TSE will be used, so you could also put this into the package at a configuration template, and then your POS dealer can just roll this out at scale with some automation, which we will see in the next slide. The portal can also be used as a rollout management tool. So after you, for example, prepared your templates and you have invited the dealers, for example, by connecting them to your POS system, or maybe the dealers joined the portal themselves and you just connected the POS system afterwards, those dealers will invite the POS operators. The POS operators are the actual users, so the end users of the middleware, maybe the owner of a store, the owner of a hotel, and so on. When these are invited, maybe all of those have different outlets. That's also possible. Maybe it's the same legal company, but they just have multiple outlets to operate in. So those can also be configured in the portal. And then, for example, we can use the rollout management or any other kind of automation or manual operation to roll out the middleware together with your POS software. And this is also described in a bit more detail in this process flow. So maybe just to reiterate through this, the common flow looks like that. First of all, the PosCreator signs the PosCreator contract in the portal. In our demo, we already had this prepared because the demo account we used already had the account signed. Then we registered a POS system, which is basically just entering some data from the POS software into the portal. Then we invited the POS dealers to the portal via the POS system, or they could just register themselves and we would connect them afterwards, so both is possible. And the POS dealer then creates their account and also signs the POS dealer contract. The POS dealer contract basically regulates some common mode of operation. It also contains the SLAs and also data how we cooperate to provide the best experience to our common end users. And then if they got invited, they will automatically link the POS system to their account, which you previously created. Then the dealer usually needs permission from the operator to sign contracts and access the POS operator's account in the portal for them. This could be part of an existing maintenance contract. Maybe it's also something you can clarify. Definitely it's something that the POS dealer need to clarify upfront before going into the next steps. Because in the next step, the POS dealer will import maybe a CSV file with the data of the POS operator. They could also do this manually, but it's usually not a good idea at a large scale. And then he can create the actual accounts in the portal of the operators. And this, for example, as mentioned here, can be done automatically via CSV import, could also be done manually. Both is possible. Also, they have the option to sign the contracts automatically, so there is also a POS operator contract to sign. And when all of this is done, the POS operator will receive an email with the signed POS operator contract. There is lots of documentation covering these 4 last steps or these 4 steps of the rollout itself. All of this can be automated in the portal. We just wanted to mention it as well in here because there are also PosCreators and POS dealers in one company, so you could have a double role for sure. With quite a lot of documentation on these topics in the POS dealer section of the documentation, which we'll have a look right afterwards. So this is just to briefly mention here that the portal is a very powerful rollout management tool. And how can the rollout happen on a technical level? Basically, we offer a broad variety of options here. You could actually do everything manually with the portal's shop and also the configuration settings. So you could manually buy TSEs for your end users in Germany or smart cards or whatever in Austria. You could then configure middleware instances manually in your POS operator's accounts if you're a POS dealer. And you could then download all of this manually onto the cache boxes. Totally doable and also supported. Maybe for a pilot installation, this might be the way to go. It's also possible to have a semi-automated rollout via the portal's rollout management feature. This can, for example, use predefined configuration templates, and it also abstracts the shop complexity away. So the rollout management makes it very easy to buy and roll out products via the portal. And of course, finally, we also have the option to do all of this fully automated via our API. More details, of course, can also be found on docs.fiskaltrust.Cloud. And since we have mentioned the docs page that often now, let's have a brief look at how this looks like. So, docs.fiskaltrust.Cloud is basically a site that is composed from our open source documentation, so all the content that is up there can also be found on GitHub. And this is just a nice presentation layer above all of these documentation pages. So if we open that now, we see the exact same page as we just saw on the slide. We tried to group the documentation into 2 categories. Documentation for PosCreators that contains the middleware API documentation, also getting started, and also the sample collection that we previously saw. And a documentation for POS dealers, which focuses more on rollout and how to use the portal for all of these things. So maybe let's have a quick look at the getting started. Basically everything that we just described in here in this webinar is also available right here with a step-by-step guide. So you should be good creating all of this, and also the concepts are explained in much more detail than we could do here in this video. Also we have an FAQ section. There is a product description currently only available for Germany, but others will follow. And of course, the same goes for the rollout documentation. So this is a quite powerful collection of documentation. Keep in mind that we also publish our release notes here. So every time a new middleware is released, for example, last time here in December, we will also post quite extensive release notes that you could have a look at if you want to get aware of what has been changed in recent versions. If you could not find the answer you were looking for in this documentation, which is of course possible, we also have a support flow that you could follow to get direct information about specific questions you may have. To do so, you should first, of course, check the docs. If that does not help, you should register in the production portal so that we have an account that we can work with. And then you could also visit the portal's knowledge base in the help section, because there are also some frequently asked questions in there, usually with very precise topics, very precise answers. So this might also be helpful. If the question still cannot be answered, please feel free to reach out to our support via support@fiskaltrust.Your country domain. And our colleagues from the support and the customer success teams will be very happy to help you. And that's it. So thanks a lot for your attention, and we're really looking forward to working with you in the future, hopefully, and to hearing back from you.